A world exists beyond that mundane little life that you live in. A world where intelligence is worshipped and pilots are God. A world filled with biotechnology that can save lives or end them.
A war is brewing beneath the surface of everything you understand to be real. Ours is a tale of revenge, love, and desperate ambition. Will you come with us?
I see you standing there, straight in an arrogance what I wouldn't give to tear you down. Welcome to episode 2 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. We are your hosts, Ellie Popov
and Charles Jazz Terrier. Low listener, what are we waiting for?
Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry. Tango waves around your neck will hang you out to dry.
Frey held her stance for a moment longer before removing herself from Wyatt. She stalked her way over to Fergus, who watched on with wide eyes. The new arrival cracked his chiseled jaw and moved into the center of the room, studying Wyatt like he was something nasty on the bottom of his big, black military boot. "Let's cut to the chase," the man continued. "If you're as good as she thinks you are," he nodded towards Frey, "which is highly unlikely, you'll become what we call a pilot." Wyatt studied the newcomer right back with immediate dislike and little curiosity. "And what is that exactly?" "Royalty," Fergus contributed. "Place in all 3 rounds, win at any cost," the man said matter-of-factly. "Here's your starting bonus." He pulled a white envelope from his back pocket and strode towards Wyatt, shoving it into his hands. Wyatt turned it over, already marveling at the thickness. Swiftly, he widened the opening to conduct a financial evaluation. "Think about how many figurines you can buy with that." The man laughed, amused at his little jab. He punctuated this with a hard slap on Wyatt's back. Thinking of the V for Vendetta bobblehead on his work desk at Lion Insurance, Wyatt flushed at yet another insight into how far the stalking from the team had really gone. He struggled not to throw the wad of cash straight into the man's face, regardless of his sizable mass. Despite the man's arrogance, though, Wyatt couldn't deny that he was interested in the offer. But there was something he wanted even more than putting his intelligence to real use. Or cash. Wyatt sucked in a gulp of air deep down into his lungs and straightened his shoulders. "I don't care about your money or your stupid tech. If I do this, you give me my mother's file." He scanned the room, waiting for the super team's reaction. After a moment, Frey tilted her head. "Only if you win," she retorted, smooth as salted caramel as she conceded. The man turned his attention on Frey, frowning, but Frey had eyes only for Wyatt. As he nodded, her smile returned, brightening her expression. Wyatt couldn't help but imagine who Frey was, beneath all this. As he watched her, she spun on her heel, and together Frey, Fergus, and the man left the room, leaving him alone with Issiah, who repositioned himself in front of the door which had closed behind the trio. The exit was abrupt and left Wyatt unfulfilled. He had so many questions. "Hey! What the hell?" Wyatt shouted after them. He moved as if to follow, but Isaiah's fixed glare deflected Wyatt from coming any closer. He called after them again. "At least give me my clothes, you bastards!" To Wyatt's surprise, the door reopened, and Wyatt retreated a step as the man shouldered his way over the threshold, tossing a duffel bag harshly at Wyatt's head. It bounced off his skull and hit the floor. "Think of it as a dress code," the man offered, smirk replastered to that arrogant, chiseled face. "There's a dress code?" Wyatt looked unenthusiastically at the bag by his feet, trying to subdue his instinctive reaction to rub his head where the bag had hit it. "For you, definitely." The man closed the door behind him again as he left. An hour later, Wyatt found himself being shepherded down a dimly lit, narrow hall by Issiah, who strode beside him wordlessly, so close their shoulders almost bumped with each step. Wyatt teetered near the edge of the wall to avoid knocking into the giant, feeling awkward, but Issiah remained steady and impassive. His predatorial grace made Wyatt feel like his own steps were more of an ungainly waddle in comparison, As they paced along, Wyatt took in the cold concrete floor beneath his black sneakered feet. The walls of the hall were a bare, dirty, scratched-up white, and that smell from the torture room still lingered, a combination of dust and disinfectant. He considered that he was perhaps being held in some kind of factory or warehouse. And the thought confused him because what were a team of eSport enthusiasts doing shacked up in a dirty factory? Wyatt felt exhaustion sink heavily into his lithe body. He fought the feeling and lifted his chest, rolled his shoulders back, and yanked at the tight collar of his new clothing. A gray, jumpsuit-type uniform. If he'd felt like a monkey before, he compared himself to Issiah, straight-backed, solidly built, the ideal warrior if ever there was one. In fact, he looked like a darker version of Ronan from Stargate. "What did that weedy guy mean, we burnt your clothes?" Wyatt spoke up. Issiah responded with silence, not so much as flicking a glance in Wyatt's direction. Wyatt tried to push Issiah into speaking, a new game to distract him from his anxiousness of what laid ahead. "What kind of uniform is this anyway? Feels like a poor man's version of Star Trek." Still, Issiah said nothing, and Wyatt felt frustration grow in equal levels with his insecurities. He tried a different tactic to get the man to speak. "Your uniform. I can dig." Again, nothing. Wyatt grimaced at Issiah's blatant disregard and was about to bait him with another sarcastic line when he watched Issiah blink, slow and controlled. Unnatural. Wyatt twitched involuntarily. He reached out, waving a hand before Issiah's face. "Hello? Anyone in there?" Issiah didn't even break his stride, never mind so much as look at Wyatt. A cold rush of something akin to fear gulped up Wyatt's spine as he backpedaled, trying to put some space between himself and Issiah. Something was not right with this man. Not right at all. In his clumsy movement, Wyatt stumbled and hit the surface directly in front of him. The end of the corridor had swung up to meet his face in the shape of a door. Wyatt straightened himself, blanching, and watched as Issiah raised his arm with creepy focus to turn the handle, pulling the door open. More concerned with the mute mountain of muscle behind him than what laid ahead, Wyatt zipped into the room under Issiah's arm. Issiah followed him like a phantom, gliding in behind him. If Wyatt had looked back, he would have seen the hint of an amused smile playing on Issiah's lips. Wyatt burst into a room filled with artificial white light. His eyes adjusted quickly, and he spotted Frey first in the room's center, standing beside a seated frame with two metal pillars on either side. Fergus was there too, crouched beside the pillar on the right, closest to Wyatt, making adjustments. Wyatt's eyes were drawn to the sphere-like tops of the pillars, which had strange grooves etched into their surfaces. Almost as if he were spellbound, casting a hesitant glance back to Frey, she smirked at his humiliating entrance, and Wyatt fought to press down his flush, trying to build some invisible armor between himself and the beautiful woman. On the far left side of the room, a row of computer terminals were situated. The arrogant military man sat before one of them, scrolling through a list of some sort. The man didn't look at Wyatt. From behind him, he felt, rather than heard, the shift of a large body, and Wyatt hastily moved to get out of Issiah's way. Reluctant to have the predator at his back, Wyatt whirled to face him, and Issiah issued him a dispassionate glare. He then took up his usual stance, guarding the door from Wyatt's escape. Frey and Fergus stared at Wyatt expectantly. He wasn't sure exactly what they wanted. What were they waiting for? Some kind of fucking magic trick? Trying to reattain some self-respect, Wyatt attempted to throw a spanner in the clever works of the group. "You know, when I don't show up to work, they'll know I'm missing." Frey blinked at him. "Jasper?" She called to the man by their computers. Jasper, still not looking at Wyatt's side, and tapped on the closest keyboard. The wall before the seated frame and pillars lit up, powered by a ceiling-mounted projector. An image appeared. The email account of Wyatt's supervisor, Lance. A flush formed on Wyatt's face as Jasper pulled up an email located in the inbox folder and paraded it in front of the team. It read, "Hey Lance, my doctor said I'll be off work for a week or so. My hemorrhoids have become infected and I can't sit without excruciating pain." Wyatt's disbelief and embarrassment escaped in a sharp exhalation. Ignoring Wyatt's discomfort, Issiah shoved him forwards towards the seated frame. Wyatt bristled with humiliation. "This is your god tech? A couple of Van de Graaff generators hooked up to a data projector?" Frey smiled at Wyatt indulgently and gestured to the frame and pillars. "This is the keyboard and mouse of the future, Wyatt. Sure, Wyatt challenged. Why don't you give me a demonstration? Jasper stirred protectively from his side of the room. Can I make him shut up now, please? Wyatt spun to face off with Jasper. Hey, you recruited me. Smarts and smartass come as part of the package deal. At Wyatt's remark, Jasper moved to get out of his chair, and Wyatt knew he was dangerously close to pushing the man too far. He forestalled him by scurrying towards the framed seat. Fergus finished with his tinkering at the base of one of the pillars, rose from his crouch, and stepped back, nodding at Frey. Frey gestured for Wyatt to take a seat, and he did, with trepidation hidden beneath a layer of false bravado. Put your hands on the sphere and wait for Jasper to dial up the training module. Slowly, ever so slowly, Wyatt laid his hands on the cool, rounded surfaces, matching his splayed fingers to the grooves in the metal. He heard the click as Jasper pressed down on the mouse pad. Blue arcs of electricity leapt from the spheres and into Wyatt's hands and arms, taking him completely by surprise. The muscles throughout his body constricted, his jaw clamped shut, and his head thrust back, banging into the frame. He felt the pull in the very core of his brain. The effect was dramatic, painful, but began to ease quickly. Within seconds, the blue arcs lessened in intensity, their connection established. Sucking Wyatt into the metal like a flesh vacuum, his muscles eased from their spasm. As Wyatt relaxed a little, he snuck a glance at those closest to him. Fergus stood by, biting his lips, the planes on his face sharp with consideration, and Frey's eyes were glued to him, critical. Jasper moved closer to Wyatt as if to better inspect his suffering, and Issiah watched on, silent and still. The discomfort is from your neural system interfacing with the technology for the first time, Frey explained, matter-of-factly. Think of it like building a muscle. It hurts now, but it will pass. She pointed to the large projected screen on the wall in front of Wyatt. The top half was now filled with code. You recognize this code? Frey probed. Wyatt managed a small nod, his head still throbbing. Finish it. Wyatt glowered at her. How do I do that? Look at the screen, Wyatt, Jasper demanded. Wyatt glanced back at the screen, and his shock rattled through him when he read the words, How do I do that? Written in large red font across the bottom of a projected square. His eyes widened in shock. Wyatt felt the electronic suction lessen further, giving his muscles room to relax. He ripped his hands from the spheres, forcing the system to fully release him. The loss of the neural connection caused his muscles to spasm, and again he fell forward to the floor, instinctively curling up in the fetal position, thrusting his hands protectively around his face. Wyatt checked his fingers over for injury, but they seemed unharmed. Frey crouched down beside Wyatt's curled body as she shot a look at Jasper, who attempted to stifle a snicker. There's no tissue damage, if that's what you're wondering. The pain you're feeling right now is from a lack of conditioning. From the room's corner, Jasper broke into a fully fledged cackle. Come on, princess, it's not that bad. Wyatt closed his eyes in response, wondering if Jasper had ever really even been hooked up to that crazy thing. Before his face, Fergus's boots drifted back and forth as Fergus studied the screen. Astounding, he said, elated. Normally it takes several tries to procure a first word, and you've got 5. Wyatt clasped his hands together to stop them from shaking. He pushed aside Jasper's outward mirth. Wyatt had actually done well. He'd met their expectations and then some. He reflected back through the connection pane and found his very blood to be buzzing with electricity. I just wrote code with my mind, Wyatt managed to form between chattering teeth. Frey nodded knowingly. Want to try again? There was no need for contemplation. He grinned between the trembles. Hell, yes I do! Jasper strode over to the stand by Wyatt's head and helped him lurch to his feet. Amusement was etched across his face, and also, there it was, a little smidge of respect. For the next few hours, Wyatt spent his time working hard, connected to the spheres and pushing himself to write more and more code through the neural link to the machine. Each time Wyatt disconnected and connected, the reconnection pain lessened, but the buzz never wore off, even as he pushed his body to its limits. Frey, Fergus, Issiah, and Jasper moved themselves around him, guiding, teaching, watching, and for the most part, they were patient. As evening fell, Wyatt was victorious in his ability to complete a full page of code, the largest attainable sequence so far. After the achievement, the team had sent him to his rooms, ignoring Wyatt's protest to continue. Frey's watchful eyes burned a hole into Wyatt's back as Issiah guided him down the corridor, Fergus keeping pace beside them. Later that night, after Wyatt was returned to his cell, he had drifted off quickly into sleep, the electronic buzz and adrenaline giving way to sheer mental and physical exhaustion. But at some point, against his better judgment, his body had awoken. He lay there for a few minutes. That could have been hours, or hours that could have been minutes, trying to coax his body into falling again under sleep spell. But his mind whirled with the possibilities of the Neuralink code. It spun with thoughts of his future, what the circuit games would look like if the spheres were only an entry passage forward. Wyatt's eyes cracked open, one at a time, wide to a cell that was still bathed in darkness of the deepest part of the night. He tried to concentrate on his breathing, a slow rise and fall of his chest, but now that he'd opened his eyes, Wyatt knew there'd be no returning to slumber. His thoughts again returned to yesterday's events. The neural link had felt so natural to him. Painful, yes, at first, but thrilling and satisfying, like he was born to be doing this, like he had finally found his place in the world, and it was right here, with these people, hooked up to their machines. When man and machine become one, Wyatt had looked forward to the day technology would be pushed this far, but had been skeptical about its appearance in his lifetime. Yes, he had read conspiracy news articles about technological military experiments in places like Russia and the USA. But this kind of technology here in Australia? No. Now? No. He couldn't believe that he, Wyatt Hawkins, had the chance to play with it, be a part of it, playing. Frey, Fergus, Jasper, Issiah, they wanted him to compete in the circuit games for them, represent them. If the gaming spheres were the base route of the competition, he'd only been newly introduced to the technology. Other pilots would have been training for years. Wyatt felt the spike of self-doubt flow grossly through him. Wyatt needed more of an edge. Hell, he needed to learn how to dominate this technology, and more so, he needed to know more about this team he'd gotten sucked into and what they were really all about. As Wyatt blinked into the darkness and listened to the silence of his cell, he became convinced that he solely was awake. Now was the opportunistic time to do some serious exploring. Sitting up, Wyatt wrenched his covers back and crept across the floor to the door of his cell, where he stopped and listened carefully. Not so much as a scurry or a breath came from the other side. He reached his hand out to feel for the door's knob and grasped the cold metal in his hand. Wyatt was turning it slowly, wary of any possible creaking, when from the darkness emerged a pair of glowing blue eyes. Yelping in shock, Wyatt stumbled back as the eyes moved closer towards him, staring at him fiercely. Wyatt continued to back up until the side of the bed tripped him back onto the hard mattress. Behind the eyes, a light switched on from outside the hall and seeped into the room, through the crack at the bottom of the door, revealing Issiah, standing over the top of it. Wyatt tried quick to think. Hey, didn't see you come in, just needed the bathroom. Issiah remained mutely above him, his expression blank. But sure, Wyatt continued awkwardly. I can hold it, no problem. Wyatt laid back against his pillow, eyes wide, unnerved by the giant. The light from beneath the door vanished and the room plunged once more into darkness. The next day found Wyatt in the room with the spheres again. The room Fergus had advised was their designated training room. Today he was to face a new kind of technology setup. Again, the system was placed in the center of the room. Yet between the two pillars with the sphere tops, the chair had been removed. Wyatt looked confused, sure that each element of the setup was a piece of the same whole. Fergus, dressed once more in those strange coveralls, was crouched beside the station, bolting one of the spheres into the body of the pillar. There we are. Impressive. Wyatt, who by now had come to the conclusion that things would go a little easier for him if he tried to make friends, smiled at Fergus, who stared blankly back, missing the social cue. Instead, Fergus nodded. Yes. And began staring at him, looking like he was studying a science experiment. Wyatt averted his gaze, awkwardly from Fergus, thankful when Jasper burst into the room. Playtime's over, princess, Jasper announced, a pleased smirk plastered across his lips. Today, you learn how to take a hit. Wyatt planted his feet, narrowing his eyes at Jasper. This was bullshit. This was not what he was here for. Whoa, I thought this was computer gaming we were talking about, not WWE. He protested loudly, his hands splayed in a cross before him, clarifying his intention of non-participation just in case they'd missed it. Jasper snorted out a laugh. WWE? That's your combat go-to? Wyatt flushed. I never said. Jasper's smirk widened into a derogatory grin that left Wyatt feeling like a little boy. I never asked. He nodded to Fergus, whose face lit up as he headed over to the computer panel by the far wall and pulled up a program Wyatt couldn't quite cite. Jasper paced before Wyatt, a professor about to deliver one hell of a lecture. The circuit games, Jasper began seriously, has 3 rounds over 3 consecutive weeks. The first round is split over 2 nights, placement and round 1. Wyatt stopped whispering a death curse for Jasper in his mind and listened carefully. Placement? Was that like round 1? Jasper ticked a finger at him. Correct. It's pure coding and hacking. No problem for a phantom freak like you. For round 1? Wyatt questioned. Jasper stopped pacing in front of Wyatt and hovered in close. Round 1 is combat. Wyatt was no soldier, no fighter, and Jasper knew it. He had no idea what the man was playing at, but he wasn't about to back out now. With more confidence than he felt, Wyatt inclined his head at Jasper's challenge. Bring it on. Jasper raised an eyebrow in response. At that, Wyatt allowed himself a little smile and glanced over to Fergus, who was still queuing up his next challenge. Wyatt was going to nail this. He had to. The live feed from the training room showed through the minimalistic glass monitor on Julian's desk in 8K quality, and he hungrily took in every detail. Just a boy. Wyatt was just a boy dressed in men's clothing, barely a line of stubble on his cheek. And they were running out of time. Julian had been watching through his cameras for almost 3 days now. From kidnap to pilot conception. Waiting. Judging. Monitoring any spark of usefulness that flared from the youth's actions. But Julian was not convinced. He touched his hand to his monitor and flicked the image towards a panel of floor-to-ceiling windows, which instantly morphed into different screens, obscuring part of his view of the Gold Coast cityscape lit up at night. The screen showed numerous angles of the training room, allowing Julian to capture every tiny detail. Removing the jacket of his suit, Julian folded it carefully and settled into his chair, watching Wyatt approach the spheres through his screen. Julian didn't so much as blink as Wyatt placed his hands on their grooves, and they brightened with a blue glow. Though he knew the pain himself well enough, he had no empathy for the boy. Only speculation. Wyatt connected to the interface with barely a flinch, his tolerance already showing signs of improvement. A good sign.
Yesterday you thought words, and they appeared. Today you learn how to punch with your brain.
The audio of Jasper's words crackled through Julian's surveillance system and echoed around his office. Julian continued his observation through the eyes of a hawk and wondered out loud to none but himself and the empty space around him. Would Wyatt become the predator, or would he become the prey? Jasper felt a combination of increasing satisfaction and annoyance as he watched the projection of Wyatt's avatar in combat against an AI-programmed bot play out over his shoulder. He told Frey, warned her even, that the kid did not have what it took to be a champion pilot of the circuit games. Did Princess have skills? Yes. Did he have experience in any form of combat fighting or even contact sports? No. What the fuck was Jasper supposed to do with that? Wyatt was pale from lack of sun, his muscles thin with disuse. Jasper would bet his life on the fact that he had never seen a single day of his childhood participating in a karate class or running around with his school friends playing rugby league. Hell, Jasper bet this kid probably hadn't even played a round of Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat on the PlayStation. Too soft. He looked more like the World of Warcraft type. Jasper scoffed out loud as Wyatt's avatar cupped a hit to the head from his bot opponent. His avatar's life percentage drastically draining. He watched as Wyatt's face flushed in embarrassment. Come on, princess, focus. Threw the words of the kid half-heartedly, kind of wanting him to do better, kind of not. If the kid was the failure Jasper thought he was, Jasper wanted rid of him pronto. He didn't want to waste any more time. Wyatt's brow furrowed as he focused, pathetically trying to follow Jasper's direction. The bot sprang another hit, and Wyatt's avatar glitched dramatically, its life percentage drained to 0. And you're dead, Jasper needlessly announced. Wyatt, panting, turned to face him as if to say it wasn't over yet, and Jasper wanted to laugh. The day continued with the same pattern, much to Jasper's barely tolerant consciousness. Over and over, Fergus reloaded the program and set another round, Wyatt's opponent fighting at a level dictated by Jasper himself. By midday, Jasper was shoveling Chinese takeout into his mouth, listening with satisfaction as he heard Wyatt's stomach growl at the aroma spreading across the room. Fergus had left Jasper and Issiah alone to babysit the kid. He'd thrown Jasper a last look on his way out the door, his plea to Jasper to go easy on Wyatt. But patience was Fergus's thing. Soldiers learned by pure force and impact. The bot threw a hard punch right into the gut of Wyatt's avatar, ending this round's life percentage for Wyatt. "Dead," Jasper said between mouthfuls. He spun on his chair in the computer corner and reloaded the program again, watching as Wyatt wiped the sweat from his fingers onto his jumpsuit and retook the controls. Wyatt had been at this for hours now, and Jasper knew the neural link was probably burning through Wyatt's veins. But Jasper didn't care. He'd either break the kid, or he'd break him down. The bot hastened straight into offense, and Jasper watched as Wyatt's fingers turned white, his grip too tight for the controls. He stumbled through a fly kick sequence and made it clumsily into a floor swipe before Wyatt's avatar froze up completely. The bot moved in hastily for the kill. "Dead." Wyatt, sweating and pale, threw a dirty look at Jasper, who only grinned and inclined an eyebrow before reloading the program. This time, Wyatt flew at his opponent at full speed. His focus prioritized on offense. Jasper's side of the fists of Wyatt's avatar flailed, and the bot redirected Wyatt's speed against him, using it to coat hanger his avatar. Jasper rubbed his forehead in frustration. "You're dead! Again!" Wyatt breathed between clenched teeth, pointedly not looking at Jasper. The kid was determined, he'd give him that much. Jasper reloaded the program. This time Wyatt appeared to get the upper hand against the bot. He moved from a punching sequence into a floor swipe, knocking the bot's legs out from underneath itself. Sitting forward with mild interest, Jasper caught the small smile that twinged at the corner of Wyatt's lip. But Jasper knew it would be short-lived as Wyatt let his ego get the better of his focus. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. To Jasper's dismay, Wyatt attempted to repeat his punching combination, but his bot opponent had learned from his pattern. In retaliation, it began to launch a series of quick, concessional hits. Wyatt didn't manage to block a single one. The round quickly spun out of the kid's control and his life percentage drained to 0. Disbelief, disgust, and frustration filled Jasper to boiling point and bubbled well and truly over. This kid had no instincts, no capacity. "No!" Jasper's shout broke through the sounds of the game as he launched his own attack against Wyatt. "Why would you not block that attack?" Wyatt glared at him, his own frustration clear on his face. "I was trying a different approach, okay? Blocking a hit takes time." Seething laughter escaped from between Jasper's teeth before he could control it. His exasperation took a hold of him, forcing him to his feet. His blood leapt a little in satisfaction as he flagged Wyatt's ill-hidden cringe. "Have you ever been in a real fight?" Jasper asked, his voice dangerously low. Wyatt hesitated, but Jasper already knew the answer. He nodded to Issiah, who had been laying on the floor. At Jasper's signal, promptly rose to his feet, and together they both approached Wyatt, Jasper inclining his head to Issiah as they neared him. Issiah shook his head. Wyatt watched the two men draw closer, his bravado drained from his face. "No, but what does that have to do with—" Jasper lashed out, hitting Wyatt square in the gut. Wyatt made a little "ugh" as the air left his lungs and forced him to curl into himself. Feeling lighter inside, Jasper resumed the voice of a lecturer. "It's not a race. Blocking takes time. So does recovery. Protect your gut and work at full capacity." He paused for a moment, giving Wyatt a shove with his foot to help drive the message home. Take the hit, and you just made life harder for yourself. Got it? Or do I need to do it again? Jesus, Wyatt managed to squeeze out breathlessly. Jasper released Wyatt, feeling the pull of his trademark smirk on his face. "Just be thankful I didn't go for the family jewels." Without comment, Issiah extended his hand and helped Wyatt to his feet. Though Jasper's eyes were taped shut, He could see the blaring overhead fluorescent light shining through his lids, turning his world a blood red. He urged his lids to open, but his body ignored the request. Around him, Jasper heard the deep mechanical breathing of others, soldiers hooked up to medical machines filling their lungs for them, himself included. The plastic piping in his throat grated the inside of his flesh painfully. Jasper started to choke, but the muscles in his throat wouldn't work properly. He couldn't dislodge the foreign object from his body. Jasper tried to speak, tried to breathe, then a hand, gentle yet firm, feminine, reached for him. Soft skin pressed against his, grasping his forearm in comfort, as if to say, "I am here. I've come to bring you home." Jasper jolted into consciousness, grounding himself to the squeezing of his forearm, imploring him to wake. Through blurry eyes, he took in the familiar scratched-up white walls of the sleeping hall in their current base. He felt the easily transportable trundle bed beneath his body, his feet almost teetering over the end. The thumping of Jasper's heart started to slow as his body regained control when it realized he was safe. "Easy there, Tiger," Frey soothed. Concern etched on her face. She placed a foam cup of coffee on the crate beside Jasper's head and plunked down her black medical kit by his feet, spreading it open. Jasper forced his bleary eyes to focus through the brightness of the morning light, which trickled through the papered-up windows of the room. He was unwilling to let Frey sense the lingering weakness his dream had instilled in him. The sound of the mechanical breathing still lingered in Jasper's ears. He raised his wrist to check his watch and sat up, propping himself against the mountain of pillows on his trundle bed. The small luxury Jasper had actually insisted on. Crap. It was past 9. Jasper had overslept. He reached for the steaming coffee and took a gulp. The movement caused the thin cotton covers to slip from where they were gathered at his wrist. Frey quirked an eyebrow, seeming unfazed by his nakedness. Jasper supposed it wasn't anything she hadn't seen before. "You know, if you'd let me recalibrate your circadian," Frey's first go-to was always her tech. And though he could admit it certainly had its uses, he tried to avoid any more contact than was absolutely necessary. Like Panadol, a band-aid for the body, but never a solution. Like what was inside of him. Jasper shook his head. "No. Nice try, but I'm already a walking, talking guinea pig. I don't need any more of your tech, thanks." Frey just shrugged her shoulders. "Suit yourself." She dipped her hands into the black medical box and pulled out the dreaded futuristic-looking glass syringe. So large it looked like it was made for a horse. The needle itself was particularly long and made of silver, rather than stainless steel, and its large fluid bay was empty, taunting him. Frey took a step towards Jasper. The only way he was going to get through this again was to avert his gaze from the needle. Testing Jasper's blood was a regular occurrence every week, to be exact. A strongly unpleasant experience for him, by the way. As Frey hunted him, Jasper tested her for wiggle room. Is that completely necessary? Frey inclined her head. Completely. Just a little prick, she said brightly, ushering him to reposition himself. Jasper stayed put. Someone's had their caffeine already. Frey huffed, beginning to lose her patience. Frey was a good sport most of the time, but she didn't appreciate any unnecessary fucking around. Come on, you know the drill. Reluctantly, Jasper shifted, offering his bare back. He felt the graze of her thumb on his tailbone, following his spine upwards a little before it came to rest on the tiny silver implant. Jasper didn't flinch as Frey pushed the needle easily into the implant's opening, sliding the silver end deep into his back with a delicate, steady motion. When the suction from the needle began, withdrawing Jasper's life essence from his body and drip-feeding it into the syringe, goosebumps broke out all over him and he clamped his teeth to steady his mind while he tried not to puke. Less than 30 seconds later, and Frey retracted the needle. Jasper turned himself slowly to face her, as she placed a cap on the tip of the syringe and sloshed his blood around it in the bay. Seeing it like that still caused Jasper's heart to sputter, and he wasn't sure if he'd ever get used to it. No longer was his blood the deep crimson that humans had fought wars the world over to prove or disprove that the same blood ran in every being's veins. No, his blood was now a deep purple, with only a taint of red left behind. Metallic particles swirled in the purple liquid, glinting out of Jasper from behind the syringe bay glass, mocking him, reminding him that the biological changes in his body had made him both human and something else. Not that he could ever forget. A green light blinked out from the syringe in Frey's hand, and Jasper watches her slanted eyes turned up in delight. Good. Funnily enough, Jasper retorted. Frey had claimed that the regular tests were a necessary evil to track the technology in his blood and make sure it was working as it should. But Jasper knew it was the only way to track him, whether she admitted to it or not. The blood would tell her if he so much as sniffed a joint. Frey threw Jasper a contemplative look but remained wordless as she packed the extraction syringe back into her medical case and locked it up. Firmly. She handed Jasper his cooling cup of coffee, imploring him to snap out of whatever mood he'd just woken up in. Jasper knew Frey so well that he could almost hear her thoughts. The woman was a mother hen who loved him, and likewise the babysitter who often wanted to murder him. She was his doctor and his keeper. She was the last link to the best friend he'd ever had. As Frey exited the room without a backwards glance, Jasper took another sip of the bitter liquid in his cup, eyes following her out the door. When she'd left Jasper's line of sight, his hand reached absent-mindedly for the inky black Valkyrie tattoo etched into his chest. Wyatt was haggard and dripping with sweat, the small air conditioner in the room seemingly useless in its battle to cool his exhaustions, clearly unable to keep up. Returned to the gaming station in the training room this morning, he'd been at it for hours. His eyes desperately glued to the projected screen on the wall, Wyatt visualized the inside of his mind twirling. He then watched with gratification as Avatar swirled the knockout kick to the head of his bot opponent. There it was. He'd won. Wyatt had been on a winning streak all day. He would never admit it to Jasper, but when the man had thrown that hit to his gut, Wyatt grimaced at the memory. It had actually worked to reconfigure his instincts. Wyatt's combat tactics had changed for the better. His avatar now competing as a man, no longer a mouse. Wyatt took educated risks. He launched his avatar forward into assaults that dictated the pace of the match. He challenged and explored the bot's ability to learn, never replicating the same combination in exactly the same way twice. Though he resented the fact that Jasper had hit him quite so hard, even now as Wyatt breathed heavily, wilting where he stood, he'd feel the crush of the bruise against his abdomen. The pain reminded Wyatt of how weak his real physique was, in comparison to his avatar, in comparison to Jasper and Issiah. Annoyed at himself, Wyatt straightened up. He must not show these people any weakness. Wyatt would get through the circuit games victorious. He would get those files on his mother, and he would return to Lion Insurance with a mountain of cash and attain the attention of as many crystals as he wanted. And he'd hire someone to make Greg's life just as miserable as Greg had made Wyatt's. He would teach them all some respect. No way would Wyatt Hawkins go back to being invisible. Despite Wyatt's physical exhaustion, he turned a gratified gaze across to Issiah, who was settled in his usual stance silently by the door, over to Fergus, whose pleased look lingered openly across his elegantly chiseled face, and then on to Jasper, who nodded absent-mindedly by the computers, ready to reload the program at Wyatt's signal. As Wyatt's eyes touched on Frey, he frowned at the unexpected displeasure on her face. Don't congratulate yourself yet, Wyatt. Tomorrow you won't be fighting a computer. Fergus stepped into Wyatt's line of sight, skirting around Frey's disagreeable stance. With your level of hacking ability, you should place well. So in round 1, you'll hopefully face off with an easy opponent. Easy opponent? Wyatt couldn't believe that after everything, Fergus could insult him like that. He had this in the frickin' bag. Today he'd been working this thing for hours, watching, fighting, acclimating himself as the bot clearly programmed with AI had learned every single one of his plays until it anticipated them. And still, Wyatt had outskilled the technology. Wyatt's eyes followed Fergus sharply as he maneuvered around an extra set of sphere controls he'd set up as a second station, whilst Wyatt had been fighting. He realized they were going to give him a live opponent, and he relished the idea of a new challenge. In the schoolyard, everyone knew the best way to prove yourself was to take the biggest kid down first. In this instance, amongst the Blade Runner group, Wyatt's first thoughts were that the best opponent would be Jasper, or perhaps Issiah. Then he turned to the woman across from him. whose knee-high metal-studded boots and dark-rimmed eyes screamed that she was a force to be reckoned with. In the days that Wyatt had been amongst the group, he learned that all three men orbited around Frey, respected her guidance. Even Jasper followed her wishes. Wyatt nodded cockily to Frey, watching the light dance in her steel gaze. "You want to show me how it's done?" Frey didn't deign to answer. Instead, she touched Fergus lightly on the shoulder, who without hesitation placed himself before the second gaming station. Fergus placed a hand on each sphere carefully, which glowed an affirmative blue as it accepted his connection. Fergus showed only mild discomfort, his elegant face jutting proudly up and his dark eyes sparkling. Wyatt raised his eyebrows, perplexed. Frey expected him to verse Fergus? Was this supposed to be a bigger challenge than the AI bots he'd been facing off with? Wyatt knew little of Fergus, but what he did know was that Fergus seemed gentle, non-confrontational, and certainly not violent. How would such a man be more ruthless than the bots Wyatt had been annihilating? Fergus caught the expression on Wyatt's face, misunderstanding his shock. My body has accommodated to the excessive neural stimulation. From the computer panel, Jasper rolled his eyes and queued up the match between them. A new avatar had joined Wyatt in the shape of a pretty, lithe Asian female with a hot pink streak in her straight, loose hair. Wyatt was surprised by the choice, hardly finding her to be menacing at all. As the countdown into the round began, Wyatt couldn't help but comment, "Designer yourself?" Fergus, his focus solely on the screen, didn't respond to the jab, and Wyatt shook his head in an effort to clear some lingering fatigue, which had returned with a vengeance as his adrenaline had calmed down upon being matched with Fergus. The countdown on the projected screen hit 0, and Wyatt lurched his avatar into battle, anxious to shut Fergus down as quickly as possible as Frey's slide prickled beneath his skin. Like a hurricane, Wyatt's avatar launched a series of quick combination hits to the head and body of Fergus's pretty avatar, who failed to block the assault, resulting in his health bar plummeting to 20%. Smugly, Wyatt danced on the balls of his feet, glancing over at Frey for her recognition. Wyatt knew he was peacocking, but he figured he deserved to do so. "I thought you said this was going to be hard," he voiced aloud. Frey tilted her head at Wyatt's arrogance. "I wanted to even up the playing field." The smirk dancing around Frey's full lips distracted Wyatt for a second longer than he would have liked. As his gaze returned to the screen with renewed concern at the seconds he'd lost, he heard Frey utter, "That's enough, Fergus. Engage." Then all hell broke loose. Fergus's avatar sprang forward, almost resembling Fergus with its grace. In the time it took for Wyatt to raise his avatar's arms and initiate a block, Fergus had his feet swept out from underneath him. With swift movements, Fergus forced Wyatt's avatar onto its back, and the Asian warrior mounted her larger foe aggressively and delivered a series of stunning blows. In horror, Wyatt's eyes roved over to Fergus, whose expression was matter-of-fact and all-consumed. The man's head dipped side to side with each blow from his avatar as he hummed tunelessly. Within seconds, the face of Wyatt's own avatar was crumpled to a mushy pulp, and his health meter exploded. His frustration getting the better of him, Wyatt ripped his hands painfully from the spheres and stumbled away from the gaming station. Jasper, very clearly unsurprised at Fergus's victory, powered down the program and sauntered over to Wyatt. "Learn your lesson, princess?" "Why don't you make Fergus your pilot?" Wyatt retorted, spite filling his voice as the realization of his failure drenched him like a wet blanket. Humiliation burnt red on the face of his pale cheeks. He wouldn't look at Frey. He couldn't look at her. The idea of Wyatt's suggestion seemed to shock Fergus. "Oh, no, I lack the social compatibility to be—" "Fergus is irreplaceable in his current role," Frey cut in, her silky voice free of the scathing Wyatt had expected. "But you'll do." The room fell silent as Wyatt spun on his heel, taking in the gaze of Frey, Jasper, Fergus, and Issiah, still standing by the door, watching him like a lab experiment. Wyatt caught his breath and willed the embarrassment that bubbled on his insides to calm the hell down as Frey's words rang in his ears. "But you'll do." "What's next?" Wyatt eventually said as he fought the urge to squirm under the attention of all three. "Sleep," replied Jasper. "You'll be no good to anyone tomorrow without some recharge." Evening arrived sooner than Wyatt would have liked, and before he knew it, he was trudging down the familiar darkened corridor into his cell. He wasn't sure how Jasper expected him to get any kind of sleep when he knew what was looming tomorrow. The circuit games. The fight with Fergus had rattled the confidence he gained when versing the bots, and Wyatt wasn't sure how he'd handle the defeat at the circuit, if it came to that. To be so close to receiving the answers he needed about Lizzie, so close to having the kind of future he wanted at his fingertips. He'd been given the best opportunity he was ever likely to receive in his life, and he was desperate not to blow it. Wyatt knew he had always been like a computer program full of wasted potential, but the circuit games could change all that. Wyatt reached his cell-cum-bedroom and began tiredly to pull off his jumpsuit. A shift of the air behind Wyatt hinted that someone else had entered the room, and he spun to face Issiah, who had stationed himself beside the cell's exit. Wide, almost black eyes stared at Wyatt, who quickly pulled off a clean shirt and a pair of sleeping shorts, keenly aware of his reoccurring nakedness in front of the giant. Strangely, Wyatt was becoming more curious and afraid of the intrusions. Issiah was always with him, guarding him, keeping him. "When do you sleep?" he asked Issiah. Issiah abstained from replying, something that Wyatt was finding increasingly frustrating. He probed the man again, a layer of sarcasm coating his voice. "Clearly a vampire." Unexpectedly, Issiah shifted from his stance and approached Wyatt, who instinctively began to back up. When he was merely inches from Wyatt, Issiah raised his thickly muscled arms, reaching for Wyatt's neck. Fear leaked into Wyatt like molten lead. "Hey, man, that's cool, whatever." Isaiah's hands wrapped around Wyatt, easily engulfing the thin cylinder of Wyatt's neck within their cool grip. Wyatt felt the choke of his last breath in his throat as he raised his palms in pure panic to collide with Isaiah's solid chest, preparing to fight him off. But the man was unmovable, and as heavy as a stone statue. Isaiah's fingers pushed down to the base of Wyatt's neck, and withdrew slowly. Once he finished with his task, Issiah stepped back, returning Wyatt's control over his personal space. Wyatt raised his own hands to his neck, inspecting it in disbelief. Issiah had merely tucked the tag of his shirt in. Thank you, Wyatt coughed. "Thanks," he began again, voice shaking. "Maybe just give me some warning next time." The ghost of a smile flicked across Isaiah's face. Wyatt's eyes widened. "Did you just..." The cell door opened gently, and Wyatt watched with trepidation as Frey stalked towards him, carrying something behind her back. She was dressed in a plain, black tank top and soft gray track pants, her feet still tucked into those menacing boots. Wyatt swallowed a laugh as he caught sight of them before raising his gaze. Frey's face was unreadable. "He just smiled," Wyatt offered her by way of greeting. Frey's lips twinged slightly. "I'm glad to see the two of you have been bonding." She turned to Issiah. "Can you wait outside?" Issiah complied wordlessly, closing the door behind him. Alone with Frey, Wyatt wasn't sure where to stand, where to put his hands. "I don't bite," she said, her voice as smooth as velvet. Wyatt managed a weak smile. He tried matching the tone in her voice, wondering if she was playing with him. "Of course not. You're a hugger, right?" Frey just gazed back blankly, clearly waiting for something. "I mean, the steel-cap boots and armored hair definitely scream warm and fuzzy," he continued with more strength than he felt. Wyatt realized that part of him was seeking Frey's approval on a deeper level than just proving his technical abilities. He wanted her to see him. Frey suppressed a smile. "Sit down before you fall down, Wyatt," she said simply. Wyatt glanced around the room and fought a flush as he mentally confirmed that the only place to sit was on his trundle bed. As he lowered himself by the head of the mattress, Frey followed suit, sitting so close by that their knees almost touched. Wyatt was reminded of the last time he'd been so close to Frey, when she had just released him from the torture chamber he'd been kept in upon his initial kidnap. They'd been so close that he could almost taste her, and she'd pitched to him with such conviction, like she'd recognized who he was. Now Frey turned towards Wyatt, her gray eyes so piercing he almost forgot about the object behind her back, still obscured. Wyatt fought his curiosity. "So, it's a verdict." Frey cocked her chin a little, considering him. "In the past 5 years, I've trained dozens of pilots. In 1 week, you've done what normally takes months to learn. I'd say the odds are looking pretty good." Wyatt was unnerved by the almost compliment, even after I got my ass handed to me by Fergus. Frey shook her head. I only set Fergus loose on the pilots who are naturally talented, Wyatt offered. Frey's mouth quirked into a little side smirk. In need of a healthy dose of humility. There was that flush again. Wyatt tried to mask it with his sarcasm. Tell me what you really think. I think you're obnoxious, arrogant, and petulant. But the good news is, you seem to have the talent to back it up. Frey seemed to move closer to Wyatt as she spoke, the words casting a spell over him. He couldn't help the smile that crept onto his face. Well, don't look so pleased with yourself, she continued. Well, you better hope you can back it up. The circuit games are designed to test you, to push you to your limits, to see if you have what it takes. So close. Frey was so close to him now that he could see the little creases in her pink lips. Wyatt struggled to raise his gaze back to her stormy eyes. But you think I have a shot? To Wyatt's suppressed delight, Frey looked at him in the way he'd always hoped, the steel of her eyes cutting straight through to his soul. Better than most, she said gently. Wyatt knew he would never forget the look she gave him, or the smoothness of her voice when Frey had uttered those 3 words. Better than most. He knew perhaps for the first time in his life that Wyatt was being seen. Frey could see him. Wyatt held Frey's gaze until she blinked and broke the connection. She continued to stay close, and he could feel the warmth radiating from her body onto his. Frey swept her hands out from behind her back and raised her familiar-looking device near Wyatt's head. Wyatt recognized the winding metal, shaped like a headband or a circlet. The device was part of a torture technology forced upon him after he'd been kidnapped. She was just missing the mask. Wyatt couldn't help it as he flinched away from her, and just like that, the spell that had been wound between them was broken. He turned, burning eyes on Frey. No way, he exclaimed. Keep that fucking thing away from me. Frey looked resigned, as if she had expected this reaction. I know your first experience of this was under duress. Duress? Yeah, that's a polite word for roofied. Wyatt's voice began to rise further with his panic. Frey shook the device gently. Why not have rest with this? Will be worth 2 days of normal sleep. She tried to reason. Wyatt's pleasure quickly gave way to shock and disgust. How could Frey think that she had the right to push that device on him? Like hell he would hand over control of himself so willingly after the cyber squad had used the tech to abuse him. Wyatt could still hear the jarring sound of the digital distortion screeching in his ears when he refused to give Frey and Jasper the answers they'd been after. The blaring, laser-like light show still burned into his retinas painfully upon a flash of his recalling memory. Over Wyatt's dead body would he let Frey strap him into that thing again. He leapt to his feet. Didn't you hear me the first time? He shouted at Frey, driving his point home to his ill-controlled panic. At the sound of Wyatt's raised voice, Issiah burst through the cell door like a tornado poised to take Wyatt down. Frey, unfazed by Wyatt's little show of anger, held up an assured hand and Issiah visibly relaxed. Isaiah's presence was enough to make Wyatt hesitate in the middle of his freak-out, and he wasn't surprised that Issiah remained in the room now on standby, just waiting for Frey's signal to give him a smacking. Calmly, Frey waited for Wyatt's temperament to settle. We could force it on you, she tried. Wyatt moved his eyes away from Isaiah's imposing frame and flicked a spiteful stare at Frey. All gentleness between them was now dissipated. That would do wonders for my team spirit, don't you think? Again, the two found themselves caught in a stare, Wyatt aflame in his rage, and Frey an icy sea, waters churning beneath her frozen surface. Again, Frey broke the connection first, standing up and striding to the door, leaving the device on the bed behind her. With the threat clearly behind him, at least for the moment, Wyatt looked at the tech, doing his best to mask his curiosity. Frey caught on. You're dying to know how it works, aren't you? Wyatt shut her down. No? Yes. Good night, Wyatt. You better hope you sleep. With nothing left to say, she turned on a heel and exited Wyatt's cell. Her absence left a small space, feeling strangely empty. Wyatt ignored the device on the bed, climbed in under the covers, and with one last look at Issiah, he closed his eyes.
You have been listening to episode 2 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. This series is a Red Empire production and a Sound Vision Gold Coast original production, and has been written by Amy Casey, Ellie Popov, and Simon Kennedy.
This series is produced by Amy Casey and Roberto Mellini. Executive produced by myself, Charles Jazz Terrier, Ellie Popov, Steve Chickerell, Wade Boys, and Sherry Hemrick-Rowell. It is co-produced by Alex Contis and Tom Cramsie. Editing, sound design, and music is done by Roberto Mellini and Tom Cramsie. Our production partners are the scandalous, but always effervescent Organic Media Group. And that theme song you keep hearing belongs to my co-host, Ellie Popov.
As you return to your mundane little lives, listeners, my advice to you all is to keep track of our next episode drop. Future information about the series can be found at www.redempireproductions.com. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to us via whatever streaming platform you're listening to us on. Join us again. Live beyond your understanding. Mark my words, I'll find the light.